Um, Thank you. I was waiting for that to kick off. So yes, this will be recorded. My name is Samantha Tweetmeyer. I'm a doctoral candidate and teaching fellow in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University with a specialized focus on conflict resolution and negotiation in divided states. And I have been invited on behalf of PSAC 901 to moderate this event. On that note, I would like to thank PSAC 610, PSAC 901, and PSAC 555 for jointly organizing this very important and crucially timed webinar. We have an hour and a half ahead of us, which will be generally structured as a conversation between our speakers, Paige and Nora, followed by a question period. But before we begin, I would like at this time to invite Sahini Chatterjee to offer a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Samantha. We acknowledge that those of us in London, Ontario at the moment are located on the traditional unceded lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chongongtong nations on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge the role colonialism has played historically and recognize its ongoing violence and injustices that Indigenous peoples are subjected to in Canada, and we urge everyone in attendance here today to get acquainted with the work of decolonization being done by Indigenous activists in Ontario and across the country. With this, I hope we can all collectively think about the relationship we have to this land and actively contribute towards revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as supporting the activist labor of Indigenous peoples and communities through teaching, research, activism, advocacy, and community service. We recognize that land acknowledgements are insufficient without the cultivation of solidarity that is deliberate and intentional in promoting the material well-being of Indigenous peoples. Hence, we encourage our audience today to donate to and continue donating to Indigenous community-led organizations as an ongoing commitment to equity. We also urge everyone to amplify Indigenous voices as well as their needs, demands, and aspirations as an everyday investment in justice. Please look up the land you are on through the Natives land.ca website. We'll post the link in the chat as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sohini. So by way of brief introduction, it's time to step up, white folks, and take responsibility to do the labor required to examine and dismantle racism and Islamophobia. Racialized and Indigenous students are exhausted from doing this work, and it is our responsibility to take on more of this labor. As racialized and Indigenous people around the world are standing up to defend their humanity and right to live a life of dignity and freedom, there has been a slow movement towards adopting equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization lenses by institutions within which the vast majority of us work. And meanwhile, white people themselves have been moving towards recognizing that our society, our organizations, and our academic institutions are actively promoting racism and Islamophobia in ways that they had not noticed or understood before, be it in the workplace, student organizations, associations, unions, and so on. And so many white academics, such as myself, both affected and horrified by these realizations, are asking, what can I do and what should I do? How can I support my racialized and Indigenous colleagues and union siblings as they encounter the overt and covert ways that racism manifests itself in the organizations of academia? It is these vital questions that Nora Loreto and Paige Galette hope to address in this webinar today. Although I'm sure the answers will not be immediately found in the next hour and a half, but we hope to get a good start. Before we get started on that journey, we want to take a temperature test of the room in terms of your stage along that journey. And I would like to direct your attention now to two questions, which I'm going to post in the chat first. And there will be a poll launched shortly. And this is a private poll. We just want to get a sense of where our audience is on these two questions. So the first is, I am comfortable talking about racism with my peers, friends, colleagues, and coworkers. Yes, no, not sure. And I am comfortable challenging racist comments or behavior from my peers, friends, colleagues, and coworkers. Yes, no, unsure. So I invite you to answer the poll when I launch it. And I'll just give you a couple of minutes to work your way through this. Thank you. Okay, so just about 10 more seconds, and then I'm going to end the poll. So if you haven't submitted your answers yet, please do so now. Okay. So I guess I can use the share results. I'm not very accustomed to the Zoom polling system, apologies. So I'm going to share the results. There we are. So we feel we have an audience that is fairly confident moving forward along this journey, which I am encouraged by. It means that I think Paige and Nora can take this conversation towards a later stage, as it were, in advancing our discussion about how we can contribute to the work that needs to be done. I'm having a screen problem at the moment, apologies. I don't know how to deal with it. Oh, there we go. Okay. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts in our poll. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our two presenters. Paige Galette was born in Montreal, raised in London, Ontario, and makes the Yukon her home currently. She is a nationally based community organizer and educator with a strong background in governance and policy. Her work is strongly rooted in anti-racist and anti-oppression frameworks that address equity-based issues. Oh, I just realized my mechanics today are not perfectly up to snuff. And secondly, Nora Loreto, who is an activist based in Quebec City. She is the author of Spin Doctors, Take Back the Fight, Organizing Feminism in the Digital Age, and From Demonized to Organized, Building the New Union Movement. She is also one half of the excellent political podcast, Sandy and Nora. And she is also the editor for the Canadian Association of Labour Media. We are very grateful to have these two absolutely wonderful and accomplished individuals to give their time and knowledge to us today. And so I encourage you to settle in for what I'm sure will be a lively discussion between Paige and Nora. Take it away. Thank you so much.
Totally. Thanks, Samantha, for that wonderful introduction.
Thank you so much. Hi.
Hey, Paige, how are you?
I'm good. I'm cold. It's snowing. It's winter. How are you?
It's the same here. It's the same here. And we were supposed to get a bigger snowstorm and we haven't. So I'm a little bit disappointed because I know you love snow and winter. I love snow and winter. And I know that folks watching all probably had some variation of that storm that went through Ontario yesterday and the day before. I thought it was great, but I know a lot of folks are like, when is this over?
Yeah, that's pretty much where I'm at. As much as I love the north and winter, I'm done with it.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, we're back at it. We're talking about anti-racism and racism in academia.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about
Yes.
it, Nora?
Well, yeah, so this is a really, I mean, the last time we had this conversation was a while ago. We still had no vaccines. It was in the summer of 2020, and it was a really, I thought it was an interesting conversation, based on how people reacted to it. Like, there was a lot of nervousness to start off, like, oh, what do you mean, like, talking to white people anti-racism, this is really weird, and then at the end of it, it was like, oh, that was great, you were just talking, right, which we're gonna do again. And so I really like how we're being asked to start this, which is this question about what's the difference between anti-racism and racism. And so Paige, I don't know, what in your mind is the difference between anti-racism and racism?
Yeah. To put it in simplest terms, for me, it's the difference between actively combating racism versus being pacifist around it. And, I love that you brought back the context of 2020, because we need to recognize that so much has happened within movements and resurgence of movements, including the Black Lives Matter movements. But at the same time, we also saw the resurgence of people being what they call in allyship and claiming to be anti-racist when they're not. So for me, the way that I see it is when organizations and institutions have claimed to be anti-racist by organizing either like more jobs for racialized people, and yet not changing the culture of their workplace, culture that needs to be recognized as white culture, or being able to address racism in ways with a very specific language without even talking about decolonization or decentralization of whiteness. So for me, that's where the differences rely, especially post 2020. What about you?
Yeah, well, I think like it's like, yeah, it's the word anti-racism is such a great word, because it's the active resisting of racism. And so whenever you have any kind of structure, any kind of organization, whether it's a formal organization that's attached to a university or a student union or a faculty association or anything, a department, an academic department, it's going to be embedded with the logic of white supremacy. And that logic of white supremacy is going to manifest itself in a whole bunch of different ways. And most of those ways for white people are going to be invisible, whether they're invisible because you're not paying attention, or you haven't really understood how these things are or operate, or maybe you're participating in them, and so you really have no ability to separate yourself from this moment and say, whoa, like, okay, I see how racism is manifest in this place. And so when we talk about racism, it's those acute kind of expressions of this white supremacy is usually the things that we think the most about. Of course, there's systemic racism as well, but mostly racist acts it's what harkens to people's minds. Oh yes, this instance of racism. And so when we're talking about being not racist, being not racist is to stop those individual incidences of racism from happening. So you don't want people to say words that are hateful. You don't want people to make comments and these kind of acute expressions of racism. But even if we were not racist, we still live in this white supremacy. And so unless we are being anti-racist, which is to fight against those expressions of white supremacy in the systemic structures that exist within all of these institutions or whatever, then racism is always going to be present. And maybe to make this more concrete, it's like the difference between an organization that's had a problem with racism, let's say for a really long time, and they're like, oh, we're going to solve this by having a not white leader. Maybe, maybe that'll help.
Oh my gosh. I obviously am laughing at the subject because this is what happens everywhere at every place. And without, the other thing that we saw is the famous EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, with forgetting what inclusion even means. Forgetting even words of inclusion actually means, again, that change of culture. But also just using your example of like changing, the person leader. leadership without even checking in to see who that person is. Sure, they're racialized, but do they even have ties to the community? Do they themselves understand their position and how they, what I like to say, coddle white supremacy? And we see those types of either themes or language when we talk specifically around anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity. We saw language around anti-Asian sentiments without actually thinking, what does racism against Asian folks, whether it's East Asian or South Asian, looks like. So for me, it's really fascinating that we're holding this conversation, but I'm hoping that we don't always have to rely on Black death or people's death or people's or any type of big experience, occurrence, or wars for us to recognize that we're still doing it, we're still actively working in it, and we're not constantly working to dismantle what you mentioned was the root cause of where racism comes from.
Yeah, like imagine how much easier it is to address these really big issues if you're not also trying to care for like a community of people that just lost members of their community. You know, like we're so used in often on the left, and this is partly because of the atrophy of where the left in general is in North America and in Canada. We're so used to responding to these horrific incidences. Oh, this happened. Oh my God, we have to fix this. Oh my God, this happened. We have to fix this, right? And, you know, when community members of that community is like, oh, great, wow, they're paying attention, like could have been before we lost another person. It could have been before this act of violence occurred, or could have saved us a lot of emotional like difficulty, right? Sadness and mourning. I think that like we have to really stop that. And we have to say, okay, so we have these organizations, we have these academic units, these departments, these city councils, whatever. What would they look like if we were actively organizing to be anti-racist? And that's, I think, like a really difficult question for a lot of people to answer, a lot of white people especially, but not just white people. Like it's very like, it can be a little bit theoretical, because it's like, what does that actually mean? Because, you know, if we replaced every white professor with a professor who is not white in the English department, is the English department going to be not racist or anti-racist? And it's like the curriculum would be different. The experience of students in a classroom might be different. But like, what about the pressures on that professor to perform? What about the pressures on that professor to grade in a certain way? What's the chair or the department like? Is there democracy within that department? And is that democracy helpful to make sure that, like, you know, a diversity of opinions are being heard? Or is that democracy being used to make sure that the majority opinion is always in place? Right. So we have to go really, really deep in our understanding of where these issues come from, and have to resist the urge to take shortcuts. Because at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff is shortcuts. That's when we talk about performativity. Oh, well, you know, just trying to look like you're doing something. And it's like, yeah, that's part of it, but it's a shortcut. Because, you know, you ask an average person, you know, here's a scenario. Do you pick the racist or the not racist result of this scenario? The average person is going to say, oh, the not racist result, obviously, right? But actually undoing white supremacy in a society, and we just started with the land acknowledgement, right? There's a reason why we have land acknowledgements, is because Canada's built on top of genocide, literal freaking genocide. And so it's going to take a hell of a lot of work to be anti-racist, even if all we're talking about is the events committee of the TA union. You know, it's going to manifest itself in every aspect of the work that we do.
Oh my gosh, I love that you're talking about the land acknowledgements. I mean, a lot of people have struggled and continue to struggle with academia and their shortcuts. I love that word, Nora, shortcuts. I'm thinking of X University. For folks who don't know, that's the name coined for what was previously known as Ryerson University. Having worked at a student union on that campus, I can tell you that the name and the come abouts of X University, or even the dismantling of that racist nonsense statue, and you yourself, Nora, you come from from X University, would know that it didn't happen overnight. And I want to precise that there was also a racialized president that was celebrated as like, oh, things are going to change finally, who it took a very long time to finally be convinced, and I say convinced, that things needed to be changed. That land acknowledgements are shortcuts, that it doesn't just start there. And I'm curious even to how long it's going to take to even coin the term and the name post X university. What's going to happen after that name change? Are we going to see more faculty being involved? Are faculty actually going to be given more power? Is there going to be more education? I see you shaking your head. Do you want to share a little bit of your experience? I'm actually curious on yours, being a student there.
Yeah, no. So like Ryerson, and I have to get used to calling it X University, but folks will appreciate that I gave 7 years of my life to that institution, and so like the name for me is like under my skin, right? But I'll try. So I was there for 7 years. I was there as a student. I did my undergraduate degree there, and as the student union for 3 years. And what was very, very interesting was just like I just said, it took an act of open hatred on campus against Muslim students at the prayer space to get students, not the university, students to start organizing around Islamophobia. And that situation, the student union was mostly white at the time, and had not really any kind of in-depth or systemic understanding of their kind of whiteness, their involvement with white supremacy or interaction with white supremacy. But there was an encouragement from Muslim students to bring a motion forward to the provincial body, the Canadian Federation of Students. And that created something called the Task Force on the Needs of Muslim Students. So it was the first study of Islamophobia in Ontario, in Canada, really, and it focused specifically on the needs of students who were Muslim or perceived to be Muslim. So not everyone was actually Muslim. Of course, this is, a little bit after it was the post 9/11 era, but a little bit after that. And on campus, what that did was that brought in students to the student union who had never seen the student union as a vehicle for anything interesting for them. They would be involved instead in clubs, in different kinds of clubs, whether they were cultural or religious or linguistic-based clubs or activity-based clubs. And the involvement of these students fundamentally changed how the student union at Ryerson operated. And it meant that like all of it, the events started to look differently, not just different, but they were like a lot more diverse. So we had a whole bunch of like lots of events, which was really cool. And it changed how and who found themselves involved in the student union. That had a big impact on the administration, who was resistant to a lot of the things that we were calling for in that study. But after that study came out, there was a year where there's just racist incident after racist incident after racist incident on campus, from students on the basketball team dealing with a racist coach, to graffiti, to eventually groups trying to organize something called the Proud Part of the White Minority at Ryerson, which a lot of racialized students were like, it's so funny, it's true, right? And it took me being like from Southern Ontario being like, yeah, it's true and funny, but also like, this is how organized racists like get into these spaces. So let's watch how this happens. We need to fight it. This incident triggered something else, which became a task force on racism at Ryerson itself. And this was the beginning of the discussions around Egerton Ryerson and his role in creating the residential school system in Canada, and in really talking about it, because there was not, I remember that so well, that there was so little knowledge on the campus that was common about Egerton Ryerson. It wasn't a person that you talked about. People actually more often thought that Egerton Ryerson was the name of a goat than an actual individual, because we had a mascot, right? Like, so, and like ridiculous fact, just because this is how white people are, like all the goat skulls are in the archives at the library at Ryerson. So FYI, that's true. Because they always had these anyway. So this was really interesting because we did this task force, and it was mostly faculty. Admin was part of it, and support staff and students, and we were sitting around the table, and a professor who'd been there for a long time said, we did this on sexism on campus, and we did this after there was a violent sexual assault in a bathroom at the campus, and it took us waiting for that moment before we actually started to deal with these issues. And now we look at the campus and we can say, there's still systemic sexism and patriarchy, but it's way better than it was in 1992. And of course, at that point, there was a lot of people saying we didn't even need to talk about racism because Ryerson was so diverse. So this was 2008. So we are talking about how many years? Like 15 years between those kind of initial discussions and saying, actually, this is so important. We need to change the name of this university is really, really, really amazing. And things are like that. They take a lot of time, but they also took a lot of convincing white people that they had to take this seriously, which is a huge part of the anti-racism struggle that we do not talk enough about.
Oh yeah, I'm just bouncing off what you're saying, but you mentioned time, and that's another thing we saw post 2020. You know how we've always talked about how movements take so long of time until pandemic hits, and suddenly nothing is about time. Everything is about quick, rapid. We're thinking, we're moving, we're changing. Give us a little bit of liberty and time to figure it out. And so, yeah, that's something I also find fascinating is when I like to say when white people have a will, there is a way. For some reason, when racialized people have a will, we're not seen as human. We're not seen as to be made whole and to be prioritized in terms of how do we fix the issues when we're not, like you've mentioned, in a moment of despair, of grief. And even when we are in those moments, it takes for white people and whiteness to be in those same moments for things to change and change rapidly. I'm gonna diverge a bit, but also for folks who don't know, I'm from London, Ontario, and I had never wanted to be at Western University. No shame, was just like, absolutely not. The whole "we are purple" and a Mustang was not for me. And the main reason was it was such a white campus for me. I never saw myself represented. I never saw anything to you know, from Saugeen and the culture there to the football and the Mustangs coming out, to the celebration of police and police on campus. This was something that I'd never seen. And I think sometimes we often talk about campuses and academia only when it affects university attendees and not thinking about how it affects the community.
Totally. Yeah. It's funny because I grew up in Georgetown. So like our closest point of reference for a university was like Guelph. And that was a bit of a different, that's a different place. That would be like you become a veterinarian or you don't go to university.
Yeah, different vibe. But what's ironic too is that even nowadays I'm looking at Western and I'm always so shocked and surprised by how many racialized people are on campus. And that flip, I still have a little like, Western, no dice, no thank you. The Ivy League of Business School is always one of them that my friends and I laugh and go, what is this private institution that nobody knows other than the gates, the ironclad gates that we see? But yeah, it's fascinating, the disconnect, and again how it can affect like even high school students in terms of our choice, even high school students or community in terms of the pride that we see around the campus and the institution. And sometimes I'd love for there to have a conversation in London around what does that pride look like and whose pride are we celebrating?
And of course we also have folks who are from Queens and from Laurier, which have very similar situations as well. I think that like one of the things that I've been very struck by recently is there's this incredible shift in the aesthetic to make sure things look diverse. And like on one hand, it's very, very important and good, and you know that should be celebrated, and we should continue in that direction. But I think we have to also be very aware of how like aesthetic changes are just aesthetic changes. That there's always got to be something underneath the aesthetic change that, you know, if you're representing your school with a non-white face, like, is your school a place where someone who's not white is going to feel comfortable? You know, it's not enough to just use people to mask whatever actually like is going on campus. And so, you know, one of the things that was very instructive for us when I was at the student union at X University was to see like where are the patterns of like which professors are going harder against racialized students, or which professors are not respecting students who don't speak English very well. Like like, can we start mapping this out? And you'd see this in failure rates or complaints against them, or, whatever, charges of academic misconduct. That was really a location. Academic misconduct was a location where we really saw that international students specifically were disproportionately targeted. And partly it was because there was just this different understanding of what academic misconduct even is. And what was the university doing to teach people what they meant by academic misconduct, rather than just assuming everyone had the same basis for understanding how scholarship operates in Canada. But we wouldn't have known that had we not been looking out for certain issues, and we wouldn't have been looking out for certain issues if we had all been white. And so I think that that's also, like, these things are so connected that it's like getting leadership structures to be more diverse is like step one, to make sure that you have the ears on the ground, the eyes on the ground, the understanding of what's going on, so that people are like, oh, no, like, this is a pattern, this is a problem, this faculty is notorious, this program is notorious. And we'll only know that because for white people, we're unable to see some of this stuff. And it's that invisibility that I think is what makes it so hard sometimes for white activists to be like, really understand that there's a problem. Like, it's one thing to hear someone talk, okay, I see. Oh, are you sure it was like that? Oh, I'm not sure they really meant it like that. Oh, I had the same experience, but I'm white. Like, all of these kinds of tropes that allow white people to have plausible deniability of what is happening. And that is really, really hard to pierce through, because you need to be open and ready for understanding certain things to be able to be told, oh, no, you're actually part of the problem. The way that you're denying this is part of this problem, even if you are on the left, which I guess gets us to the second question, which is, what is the role of white people in anti-racism?
To push, continue to push. What is the role? I mean, I often get conflicted by that question, because often I'm thinking, you already know. I'm kind of in that mode of like, I'm tired of hearing people being like, I want to be an ally, and I don't know. Again, COVID, at the very beginnings of COVID, none of us truly knew what COVID was about, and yet we were able to find ways to protect ourselves and protect our families. So you already know how to be in terms of allyship. But I think what people don't specifically know and should be willing to know and to learn is, how do you leave your space for other people, especially racialized people, to take the lead? A lot of what I've noticed, especially in community activism or any form of activism, I've noticed that a lot of the people that take the lead are people in positions of privilege and power, but forget who they're doing it for, and forget what was the mission, and how do you uplift people who are of the most marginalized groups to be the leaders at the front. And then I hear the denial, or I guess I'd call it the gaslighting of, well, it's not the right way of doing this. Well, we have to be respectful in our manners of doing this. Well, we have to X, Y, and Z. And I think of tone policing, behavior policing. Where does that come from? So yes, being able to I don't want to say step up, but to move up into that task, but to recognize also in which ways that your own way of being and your own way of activism can stem from white supremacist ways of acting, and how do we make sure that racialized people come into the forefront. The other one I wanted to mention was in terms of, oh gosh, I lost my train of thought, but you mentioned something. Oh yes, at the beginning, there was the poll around like, how do we feel comfortable in terms of addressing conversations of racism with our peers, if we feel comfortable with our peers, but we also have to recognize the power dynamic and who is being asked those questions. So for people who are white, who are in positions of privilege, it's, yes, it will be challenging and hard, but you're in a safe space. You're pretty much, if you go against somebody, even people who are in positions of power over you, people who are responsible for your research, for your thesis defense, et cetera, you are still in a position where you fall back. It's softer than racialized people. We have much more to lose. And so understanding that allyship is also recognizing that, yes, you might fall back and you might fall, but it'll be softer and you'll be okay.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I think that this is also how this denialism related to our complicity in white supremacy, it plays out. Because, you know, we're told that things are, that there's limits to what we can have. There's scarcity, right? And because of scarcity, at the end of the day, we're still always fighting over one another, and we have to use whatever tools we have in our toolbox. And if that tool happens to be a little bit of white supremacy, you know, but I still need this post, I still need this, whatever. And I think that that's one thing that you know, we white people have to be very, very aware of. Like, when are we falling back on the privileges afforded to us by virtue of the color of our skin, or by virtue of the fact that our parents or grandparents or great grandparents had property that they could give us through inheritance, right? Or have access to, you know, university level whatever because our parents were professors or our grandparents were professors or whatever, right? That this all plays a role in the space that we take up. And, you know, like, one thing I think that when white people are saying, I just don't know what to do, I'm just not sure where to start. I think it's a cop out, but it's also like a way that they're actually saying, I don't know how to do this properly. I don't know how to do this in a way that is helpful. I don't know how to insert myself in a way that's not going to take up space. And when I hear that, I haven't tried. I haven't put myself out there and tried, and maybe it'll go well, or maybe I'll screw something up, but I haven't really figured it out. Or one thing that's sometimes very obvious to me, I'm still really in a white like space with all of my friends, with all of the people I socialized around. Like, oh, this is why, is because I'm literally swimming in whiteness. And so then the question becomes, well, why? If you live in any of Canada's cities and large towns and you're swimming in whiteness and you want to be a good anti-racist ally, ask yourself, what is it about your interests, your hobbies, who you're comfortable around, who your friends are? What is it about the way that you've arranged your life that means that all of your friends and your relations and the people that you're most comfortable with are white? And this, I don't think we interrogate enough, because I think that a lot of times it's like, well, it's the neighborhood I live in, or it's not my fault, I grew up in a white town, or whatever, right? And it's like, maybe the universe is sending you signals like you're not making racialized people feel comfortable. Like, maybe people don't want to actually be your friend, or maybe you're self-selecting based on whatever your interests are, and you are engaging in that racial segregation. And that's a really difficult conversation to have with yourself, or to have with maybe your partner or your parents or whatever, people you're really, really close to, because then you might actually start discovering, oh no, you are more implicated in this than you might have thought. So let's imagine you've done this and you are like really, you know, you're connected to different communities and you know what's going on and you're like at the vanguard of activism. And then you get into meetings and it's like, oh, well, I can't be the leader because I'm white. Someone else has to be the leader. And then everyone's like, none of us want to be the leader. How do you act? You're like, oh no, but I must let you be the leader. No, you do what other people ask of you, right? This is also not a white kind of thing, right? We don't wait for the conversation to emerge. Who's the best person for this? Oh, today it's going to be Nora. Tomorrow it's going to be Paige. You know, it's like these, but instead it's like, oh, who's going to be the president, right? Like, no, we have to get out of this. And it's like, what's the skill of the president? Oh, sticking your neck out, getting slapped down by journalists, getting hate mail. Maybe we actually do want to have a white person in that role because they'll take it. Or what's the role of the president? Representing our membership, you know, being outspoken, being ready to take it, ready to fight the man. Oh, let's put a racialized person who's like there, ready to go in that role in a proper kind of with protection and safety and everything possible than an executive. And that's not the way that we have these conversations. It's literally like, oh, you're the president. And you're like, oh, okay, wow, you'll be the president. That's always going to self-select towards white people because of white supremacy.
Yep. Not just white supremacy. I mean, yes, but also like, again, that what is being seen as the good, the behavior, the proper. Oh, yes, absolutely. I wanted to go into what you're talking about in terms of student unions. No shade to the universities present today, but there is, and I'll say it, there is a history of their student unions not being the most progressive. And that's something I've also heard a lot of, even from attendees from said universities, is what do we do when the folks who are supposed to be, the most progressives have not won their elections, are not in positions of power, or there is that history of not pushing. And I'm here to say, find ways that are outside of the box. Think outside the box. Again, pandemic, we were able to do it. You don't have to constantly recreate what was done before. An example of that, I'm thinking of York University, who sure, they have some of the most progressive student union, yeah, they could take that, but also they go and look for people who are underrepresented. So I'm thinking of food workers, and I'm also thinking of the people that work in custodial services, cleaning services. Those are folks that are also part of the community, that also need to have their rights represented, that also need to have to be seen on campus, and very often are some of the most racialized workers on campus. So don't forget, the whole community as itself is not fully and solely on people who have power in the way that we understand power. If you don't have people to clean the spaces, you don't have a campus. If you don't have people to open the doors physically, you don't have a campus. And so it's also important to think about how are their rights, and specifically workers' rights, come into play when we're talking about activism in terms of anti-racist activism and on campus.
Oh my God, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it was plunging me back to the days where we were organizing in cross union solidarity at X University, and it was the mailroom workers, the food service workers that were the most radical, and then in the physical plant union, there's quite a divide between white workers and racialized workers, and it was kind of a divide based on also when they started working. So it was like senior versus less senior, and there was always a big fight. And so for us, it was so important to have these relationships with all the staff on the campus, because I mean, like, and this is really obvious, but it's so strategic. You want the person that's cleaning and fixing stuff knows what's going on. Food services staff know what is up. They know, they're watching, they're seeing every day, right? Mailroom staff know what is up. They're watching the mail, and they know how things move within the institution. And if you're trying to think of any kind of campaign that is helping TAs or RAs, you are a labor organization, and you have common cause with these folks, and not just common cause, but often with a TA, an RA union, you're also the ones tuition fees are paying for their work. So you have like both common cause, and you have a power dynamic around, what happens if tuition fees go up or down? Is it related to what they're paid? How do you then fight government to make sure government funding isn't going up and down with related to your tuition fees or your continuing fees or whatever, versus the food services workers on campus? Or are they all laid off in the summer? Like, what about that? Do they have the right to send their kids to Western for free? What about that? These kinds of things that they need the solidarity of workers that have a bit more kind of like institutional power, and students in particular don't have institutional power, but they have rhetorical power on campus. Like, they're really important students. So what kind of solidarity can you form within those kind of relationships? That's really important.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's it for me. I just wanted to say, because I'm looking at the time, but Nora, you just blew my mind in terms of workers being part of the custodial mailroom, food workers, food service workers, and whether or not their children, their dependents, are able to attend university for free. I feel like that should be a conversation for another time, but damn, you just blew my mind on that one. I love talking to you all the time. Happy Monday.
Yeah, and it's so, and these things are so amazing, right? And so, like, because this is a workshop specifically talking to white people, about these issues. Like what is the role that white people play within white supremacy? And then we can move to questions if that's if there are any, and if there aren't any, we can keep talking too. We've got other things to say. Well, the role of white people is to not deny, is to be actively involved, because if we're allowing like racialized people to do all the heavy lifting related to racism, what kind of allyship is that? What kind of allyship is for us to just allow that to continue on, right? That's not allyship. That's just pushing off people's work. We have to be present. We have to show up. We have to take on a lot of the tasks that suck. Like, we should take them on gladly. And we should be throwing around whatever kind of institutional whatever that we have. Like, do we have connections that might help with a specific campaign? Can we get access to a president's office in a way that someone else doesn't have access to them? Are our parents alumni of the institution? And are we able to call on our parents to, like, I don't even know what, like, I've never really thought of roping my parents into activism, but my parents did go to Western, actually. So there you go. I owe Western my life. And so did my partner, actually, too. But anyway, not at the same time. And so like, how can we be there? And then, really important, how are we calling out other white people who are screwing it up? Making sure that we're not letting this stuff fall to racialized people, making sure that we are calling out our own people, and we're doing it using terms and frames of reference that they understand. Because we all come from different kinds of culture. And a lot of that time, like, of course, most of the culture is not race-based. A lot of it's, regional-based or language-based or whatever. But when it comes to something that, like, if you as a white person can translate this into the terms of a white person from small town Southwestern Ontario, then you got to do that. And if you can hear the way that they're talking about stuff and you're like, I know that that's racist, then you've got to be the one to do the work to fix that, because that is not anyone else's job. That is your job, especially because you're probably related.
I feel like this is the time for me to come back, gauging the tone. Thank you so much for this. We have had a few questions come in while you were talking, and so we have some questions that I will filter through. And of course, if you are viewing and want to propose more questions, please continue to do so. I will be moderating the questions, so I will ask all the questions that come in. So let's get started. So the first question we have, you touched on towards the beginning, I think, but maybe just a more sort of direct answer, which is, how do we advance anti-racism without exhausting those directly impacted by racisms, Indigenous, Black, and racialized people?
Go for it, Nora.
Well, I mean, I can't talk about how not to exhaust other people. Like, you've got to listen to other people. Like, first of all, don't assume people are exhausted. Sometimes they're not. And one of the things that is a real problem, I think, for activists who are specifically under the age of 25 right now, there's no history in activism, and there's very little intergenerational help. And I'm seeing people 25 years of age and younger, like, burn out super fast on activism, white, not white, whatever. And so if the real question is, like, how do we protect ourselves to make sure we're not burning out at all? That's a really important question. And it's like, these are long-term campaigns. You will not see very many victories in your time on campus. You might not even see any victories in your time on campus. But you cannot burn through campaigns like a flash. You will burn out. It will drive you into bed, and you will not want to get out of bed for 5 years. So that's super, super important. How do white people then take on as much of responsibility as we can without taking up space, without taking up the limelight? Well, that is the really boring work of paying attention. And so, like, don't force the racialized members of the committee to do stuff that white people can do. Read all the minutes from Senate, read all the minutes from your Board of Governors, stay on top of collective agreement negotiations, be, like, on top of all the grievances, and look to see who's doing the work. And this is where men really have to step up too, like white men, I'm not racialized men, white men. Like, you can set up the chairs in your meeting. You can go and order food. It's not hard to order food. I guarantee you are capable of doing it. But, and it's so funny because it's like, it doesn't even matter for me. It doesn't even matter what movement I'm talking about, where I am in my life or whatever. It's always the white men who are like, oh, that's such a good idea. can you do it? You know, so really like throwing it back to other white people is really important. And then to not assume that it's like too burdensome for not white people to be involved in. You have to listen, you have to communicate with one another. And if someone is saying, I'm good, they're good. If someone's like, I'm not good, they're not good. And then you got to pause and figure out how to make sure that you can make things as good as possible.
Yeah, it's funny that you talk about white men. I'm gonna talk about that in a second, obviously. But I struggle with that question because every time I'm asked that question, sometimes I facilitate workshops and I hear it. Oh, we don't want to take up space, but it's not our job to their job to educate us. And I'm like, cool, but what have you actually done? Because yes, we're exhausted, but you're not. Obviously, you're not exhausted. And I don't want to hear it until you're exhausted. And even when you're exhausted, I still don't want to hear it. And one of the things that is exhausting for racialized people, and I'm going to speak for myself especially, is going through and having to stifle through racial gaslighting. I saw there was a question around white guilt, around white tears. So Nora, it's funny that you talk about white men. I'm going to go ahead and talk about white women for a second, and especially white cisgendered women. I don't have time for white tears, nor white guilt, nor the, oh my gosh, the white fragility, because that in itself is exhausting. And those are ways that you're taking and sucking out our energy that should be in terms of in terms of supporting our communities, in terms of us ourselves having to secure our job positions. Like, can we think about that for a second? We are actively in the movement without job security, without the benefits and the pensions that a lot of our colleagues are going through, without or have the benefits of, with still having to deal with grief, because grief doesn't just happen over Facebook. Oh my God, I'm gonna put a black poster on my Facebook and then move on. Grief is recognizing that, oh damn, the children that I'm bearing might be in this situation and I might be the black mother grieving. The community that I'm losing means that I'm losing culture through that community that keeps on dying. I'm losing, my support. I'm losing my mental health. So don't exhaust racialized people with your own guilt and your own fragility. Move past it, move beyond it. And if you have to cry, step out of the room and cry, pick yourself back up within 10 minutes and come back and do the active work.
And don't tell anybody where you were.
Yeah, we don't need to know. Legit.
I think that there's a really good observation that was made earlier as well, just about workload sharing, committee work. There's so much committee work that is just workload, and it has nothing to do with the active work of anti-racism, but it can take a load off of everyone else. And so if that's what you do, that's still contributing. I think that's a great way to look at it.
Well, and if I could just jump onto that, because I think that the discussion on EDI is a really important one, and it actually dovetails into this whole question about the mundane work of the academy. So much work is eaten up by committees. And now we're just talking about you all know what all the different kinds of committees that every department has to strike. And when you have an EDI position that insists that you have women and or racialized people racialized people on your committees, that means that there's one person or two people that have to do all the committee work just to fulfill the EDI aspirations of the university. And so I see this with my partner, who's a professor in Quebec City. His department has 2 women of 17 professors, and every one of their committee has to have a woman on it. How are those 2 women supposed to do any research at all if all they're doing is committee work because of EDI, because we want to be progressive. We want to make sure that there's women on these committees. So this is where things actually really clash with real life. And any racialized professor will tell you that on top of the extra committee work they have to do because their expertise is so sought out, they also have a community of students that relies on that person. That's a ton of invisible work, like the supports, the crying in the offices, I don't know how to deal with this professor, I have to get through this. This is all shit that white students and white faculty members do not deal with. And it's incredible how much time and how much emotion and the resources that it goes. Especially Black and Indigenous faculty members don't get tenure because they can't say that they did all of these things because they've been spending so much time with the students that they're trying to get through the university system. So until we figure out community responses to that kind of thing, to and not to even professionalize those relationships or professionalize mentorships necessarily, but to appreciate the fact that that is really important work, and downloading committee work onto a bunch of people that just want to do research is going to disproportionately impact racialized people, obviously, within an institution that's white supremacist. And then, like, to not even mention all the ladder climbing and the backstabbing and all the kind of bullshit that can happen too. So we got to be really, really sharp about how the bad things that EDI forces onto the people that it is apparently trying to bring into the academy.
That's amazing. And I think I actually will take this opportunity to segue into a question from the audience, because you kind of picked up on it already, which is regarding how we deal with white people and people in privileged positions, which can be, sort of colonized, Black and racialized people that call themselves allies, but insist on upholding the structures of white supremacy.
Make them cry. I mean, go ahead, Paige.
Yes, more than make them cry. Like, if people are in those positions and they're comfortable, I'd say not just make them cry, but make them challenge their comfort. And there's something I kind of want to bounce back on what you were saying, Nora, because the conversation around EDI and committees, and I'm not gonna say which post-secondary institution, but anyways, I was talking to a faculty association there, and they were talking about how the institution was removing all the positions of chair that were paid positions in the name of EDI, and saying, oh no, we have to make space for racialized people to do the work. And yet the institution would remove the stipends that were attached to those positions because you suddenly don't need chairs, which means that racialized people who are now doing this committee work, which Nora splendidly explained the challenges there, are also doing it for free, and that's free labor. So that's another thing, and another thing to look. Nora, you mentioned, be specific in where you're looking and focusing your activism, but be specific also when you're noticing EDI changes. Who are implementing them, right? If it's by a board of governors or administration that is made for tokenistic gains rather than the community is asking it for it specifically, look for the finer prints. Be those positions of chairs and all these positions, which now means all the white chairs are no longer doing the work, have more time for their personal research, for securing those tenure positions. Who is supporting the racialized academic people that have come in and now are taking this burden of this work, and see how are they supported? And protected in the work, right? We don't talk about protection at all. There's always this question around support, without actually looking at, okay, once they've done this work, how is it to make sure that the work is going to continue on? It's not going to be like, oh, we suddenly don't have money, so we can't do this work anymore. Or, oh, it's the next issue, it's the next I don't know more, it's the next Black Lives Matter, it's the next queer movement, so we have to focus our energy there, without recognizing that all the work that has been done is important, needs to be implemented, needs to be protected to grow. So yeah, what can people do? Again, challenge your comfort, and challenging even means holding those hard conversations straight up. Go in their offices. What are you doing? What are you doing here? You've been doing the same research forever. How is this research benefiting racialized people? What? But it's science, but it's math. Still, ask those questions. And for those specific people, when they start saying like, oh, are you saying that I should quit and not be in those positions? I like to say like, hey, I didn't bring it up, you did, but obviously you thought about it. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about what that means if you were to leave, because again, you can bounce back and go somewhere else and you'll be fine. Whose space are you taking up that other people who are racialized can actually do good, solid work in the work that you are leaving idle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to try to answer this question as well, because I say make them cry. It's a bit of a joke, but I actually think it's very important for us to speak in facts. So if someone is saying they're an ally, it doesn't matter what the fuck they say. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear. I know that we've got children in the room, undergraduate kids. Y'all. So I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. If there's nothing to back up their allyship, if the stuff that they're putting out will disproportionately impact racialized people, then you say it, then you call them out. And it depends on what kind of level of power we're talking about here, right? If it's a random professor who's not tenured, it's totally different than the university president, right? But let's be clear, universities are oppressive structures. Tuition fees mean, like, literally the charging of tuition fees means that racialized students, especially disabled students, Black students, Indigenous students, will pay more than double their degree for the white person that shows up with the cash in hand to pay for their degree all at once. Okay, so when we have institutions that are led by people that say that they're progressive and they're anti-racist, and they don't actively fight for free education, full supports for students, blah, 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 then it doesn't matter if they call themselves an ally. It literally does. I can call myself a freaking fairy. It doesn't matter. I can't fly. And so, you know, we have to get past this respectability. Oh, they've identified it that's so blah, 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 blah. No, it isn't that. What are they doing? How are they screwing up? And how can we call attention to their behavior? And then you have to have a strategic conversation. Well, what kind of individual is this? Is this someone who needs to have a private conversation? Or is this someone that we need to go to the London Free Press and blast them in the paper? And that's not everybody. That is a question of real power. And the president, you know, is Alan Shepard still your president? I'm at Western, sorry, I should say at Western.
Yes.
Alan Shepard is still the president?
Yes.
Yeah. I was on his hiring committee at Ryerson. So this is totally mind-blowing for me. Alan, who's a very progressive guy, right? He puts himself forward as being very, very progressive. Sorry, Lori and Queens folks, although I'm sure I can totally say the same thing about, there's so few presidents. I probably even know your presidents too. That it's like, hey, Alan, you literally support increased tuition fees every single year. You cannot square that circle. You literally cannot. So we have to do our best to go back to the facts and really call these people out, because it's like, look, you make $1 million off of a public institution to run education, and you're calling yourself progressive. You go full on St. Francis for us. Sell all your possessions, shave your head, and live in the woods, and then we'll talk about whether or not you can be progressive, because it's just literally, you literally cannot. Know your place. And if your place is being the president of the institution, well, you know, we're going to challenge you, because it doesn't matter. And I don't know if this question's about Alan Shepard in particular, but I do know he's someone that's very progressive, right? So no, we have to call these people out. We have to and be very, 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 very clear about that. And then the other thing is like, we also have to look at moments where racism is so embedded that for the people who make the decisions, who are mostly white or all white, they don't see it. And so here's an example. So in my partner's department, after the grad presentation, there's a graduate student seminar that every student has to do. And after the seminar, the students would all shake hands. So the one student presents, all the students shake hands, and that's the end of the seminar. And there was a student who was not white who presented, and rather than shaking hands, all of the audience left through the back door. And my partner was like, what the fuck just happened? Okay, so like log that in my mind. Let's see if that happens again. Happens again in another month. Racialized student does the presentation, all the students leave without shaking the hand. And so he raises this in a department meeting saying, what is this? Like I'm no way am I the only person witnessing this. I mean, he's an outsider to Quebec society, so he does pick up on stuff a little bit more than the folks from here. And the response was, oh, they just all know each other. Like, these are students at this university, and it is true, at this university, people go from daycare to university in the same cohort. They're just all friends. They just all knew each other. To which the response is, okay, let me explain how white supremacy works. Let me explain how this looks from the perspective of the students who don't get their hands shaked. Can we ban this activity? We can't force everyone to shake a hand if they're all like giving each other high fives because they're friends. So can we ban this activity? And it went down to the student, to the grad student committee, and they were like, yeah, we've noticed this and we didn't know what to do about it. I mean, they're chemistry students and they're master's and PhD chemistry students, right? So you're like, okay, so then how do we have this conversation? So like really identifying things that are normalized within our practices is really, really important. And until it gets named for some people, it can stay like very obscure and not, oh, of course, they've known each other since grade 2. Of course, they're all going to shake their hand, rather than being like, isn't it weird that all of our students have known each other since grade 1?
I just want to add really quickly to that, Nora, because you mentioned a good point around like chemistry students and like we didn't really talk about it, but organizing with people in terms of where they're at and using language that people understand. And again, that's the thinking outside the box. Like people will understand issues surrounding racism, maybe not the same way. I'm still shocked by so many people who are like, Paige, you blew my mind with the word racial gaslighting. I'm like, I don't understand why, because you claim to be in the feminist movement and yet you talked about gaslighting every day. But sometimes it is about tailoring our language in a way that's like, I need to see where you're at. I need to understand where you are at for you to understand the social context and what is happening. I think that's a great example of people, the grad students saying, we recognize it, but we didn't know what to do or where to go about it. We see that all the time.
Thank you for this this really good dive that I think addresses a couple of the questions that were raised in the chat regarding sort of addressing hierarchical and embedded structures. I'm going to move to it's not an easier question, but it's a slightly more like, if this is how we tackle people at the highest levels, what can people do to be everyday anti-racist allies? So sort of, if I want to be a racist ally every day, where do I start? What's the most useful sort of approaches to everyday allyship?
I want to be like laughing at Ted Cruz and be like, buy the anti-racist baby book. But legit, like start, people think it starts when you enter these spaces of academia or enter these spaces that are very privileged. Like we have the resources and the tools and the skills, especially today, where you don't have to enter these spaces of privilege to be suddenly awoken, right? So I'd say start with your communities and start with your smaller communities. It is harder, anyways, I'm going to speak for myself. It is harder for me to hold these tough conversations with my family than it is to check somebody in position of power. Why? Because I don't care. I could go to a city councilor or somebody, the PM, whatever, be like, I'm going to tell you how it is. And then I go home and I'm relaxing and I'm chilling. I could not do that with my family. That is hard. So start there. Start with the little babies. We talked about, Nora, I'll give you your flowers. You talked about intergeneration and how burnout happens. And I think a lot of the burnout is because we take it upon ourselves to do the work without recognizing who the community is. Elders have so much knowledge, and their knowledge is powerful. It's so fascinating for me to see that, especially in our Canadian context, we don't take in consideration elders until we're talking about residential schools, until we're talking about anti-indigeneity. We're not recognizing that Black people have elders, that brown people have elders, that they too have had to go through the systems of oppression in this country. So reach out to the elders, give them space, reach out to the young babies, give them space, and make sure that the burnout doesn't just solely happen with you, that other people can also burn out as well.
Yeah, well, and actually you're making me think of like, if you don't know who the elders on the support staff side of your institution are who are racialized, you're not organizing. I mean, like those are the folks that literally have seen it all and they've been at this school forever and they know what it looked like 30 years before they got there, and then they've got the 30 years of experience that they've had there. And if you haven't had those connections with like through inter-campus or on-campus like union organizing, it's a huge lost cause, a lost opportunity. We learned so much from the elders that worked in food services. We learned so much from the elders that worked in the mailroom about how the university ran, about the values of the university, flashpoint moments that we had no idea about, like just they know what's up. And so oftentimes I think that young people being very broadly speaking, forget to like find other allies who are not just students. You really have to break out of it. And it's not just professors. You're going to find a lot of other folks on campus that are not just the professors and who will have a little bit more time, because a lot of the professors are like, oh my God, I'm in a committee meeting. I can't help you. I'm losing my mind, right? I think, how do you do this every single day? I mean, it's kind of a mindset. It's kind of changing a mindset, and it's really important to do so. So like, make sure you've diversified what you're reading every day. Like get the authors that you love, like follow along on conversations on Twitter. Don't have anything to say about them. Just read, right? Read the conversations that are happening that you can see. I mean, what a wealth of knowledge that a lot of these online spaces are that you aren't a part of, but they're there. You can read them and you can see the debates. Like, hell, today's a really good example of like the Oscar post-Oscar discussion, right? And you don't have to be there being like, got to get the best take, got to get like, you can just see how people are grappling with something that is got a lot of different kinds of opinions that people are feeding into it. Totally rich, totally like fertile location for you to like understand where people are at. And then, I think that if you're involved with anything on campus, any committee, any association or any club, look at your executive. Are you majority white? Why is that? Figuring out how to fix that. That's a really important first step. Looking at your departments, why are they all white? Talking to faculty within your departments and saying, what's the history? Like, is this department more white than it was 30 years ago? I bet you'll be surprised at the answer, because the answer is going to be, yes, it is more white. Like things are atrophying, right? This is also about a mindset change. Things today are not better than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. They are worse. And so what happened to Black faculty? Have they been chased out of this department? Have they been forced into leaving the academy because things have been so difficult? Or was there an exodus from Queens because there was a thing that happened and they all went somewhere else? Get like understand the histories of your departments to figure out what has led to this moment to have this majority white faculty complement. You will be shocked to find out that like, yes, in 2007, there was this moment and 5 of our racialized faculty members left. And it's like, oh, well, that's pretty good to know, because this stuff echoes through history. When people were hired in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s, there's a huge historical range of why things look today the way that they look. And they did not start 5 years ago. They started up to 35 years ago and maybe even longer. So that's really, really important. I think that, look at who you're collaborating with, and if you have any say in hiring, who are you hiring? What are the hiring processes that you engage in? Figure out faculty members, who has the students that are only white, who has the only student, like those kinds of mapping can be really interesting. Like there's just so much that you can do. And if it only starts with you reading a lot more from people who are not white, fine, start there. That's super, super important.
Nora, I think you're being modest, but I'm going to say it anyways. But also listen to Sandy and Nora talk politics. I like podcasts, but for real, like there's also, you have the power and the ability to create resources. And Nora, again, oh my gosh, we could talk about this forever, but you talked about archives and what is in the archives. And we often don't think about how things are being put in archives and the racist connotations towards that, but also the ability to create resources for educational purposes. So if you hear a podcast and you're like an episode, share it with your peers, share it in your own classrooms, share it with your family and friends, start the conversation there. If you yourself don't have the vocabulary or don't have the ability to create those types of resources.
That's really good advice. If you found the good, like get it out there, share it with more people. I'm going to move into a couple of what I've been told are the tough questions. And I do want to highlight as I move into these questions, because we are coming towards the end of our session, that I think when you look at what happened to people in your faculty or what's going on or why aren't they getting tenure, that one question that's in the chat about student feedback surveys and faculty biases in our course evals, which is related to hiring, has a lot to do with it, which you can pick up on if you have time. But the questions I would like to pose at this point are for people doing this work. I suppose it's questions that they confront, or comments that they might confront. So the first comment is sort of anti-racism is racist. Not fair that my racialized colleague gets appointment over me, that type of language. And unions should stick to non-activism stuff, their labor focus. So these types of challenges you face if you're in the union sort of world and you're doing this work, and how we might address these questions and challenges, or if you're in the audience thinking these things right now.
Maybe I'll start. I mean, if you're bitter that you're not getting advancement because a racialized person is getting advancement, you suck and you shouldn't get advancement. I don't even care how good you are as a researcher. You just suck. That's not cool. We are in a moment right now. Okay, like the academic hiring world sucks like crazy, and it is not the fault of anti-racism. It is the fault of years of underfunding. It is the fault of governments trying to turn higher education into a mass system, a system for everybody, and not actually transforming the system to be a mass system. So everybody can go, but there's no positions anymore because there's not enough money to hire. There's not enough spaces to have the classes. Classes have to be up to 500 to 1,000 people and all this kind of stuff. So redirect your anger. There's no Black person whose decision it was to do that. Like the fault lies with every university president that cheerleads this, with Doug Ford, with Kathleen Wynne, with Dalton McGuinty, with Ernie Eves, with Mike Harris, with Bob Ray. Those are the people who you should be targeting. And they're all still alive. So you could still target them if you wanted to. So that's, I think, really, really important. Is it a moment for white male academics that is harder to get hired than maybe a decade ago? Yeah. And guess what? It was harder for non-white academics to get hired for the fucking entire existence of these institutions. So suck it up. I think that like the academic world is horrible. It's really, really difficult. I only have a master's, and I only have witnessed this as like my partner and I got together while he was doing his postdoc. And so I lived through the postdoc land, and then I lived through the job search land. And now I lived through pre-tenure and then post-tenure. And then he doesn't speak the language. So all of the craziness that comes around like a language problem within the institution. And it is horrible. I know that it's horrible. And he's a white guy. It's really, really difficult. And I think that trying to fix the situation to make life for academics better helps everybody. It helps everybody. And making this about, well, EDI is stopping my advancement as a white male. You know what? Go to the private sector. There's tons of spots open for that for you. You know, take 7 months off work because you have the money saved up because you have an inheritance, right? I mean, we just need to be really, really real about this. And if people are genuinely concerned about it, they don't know how to like talk about it. This is where white people need to talk to one another and remind each other, no, this is why this is happening. This is trying to correct systemic issues that have long played in white people's favor. And if you were born at the wrong time to benefit from that, I mean, sorry, I can't get a job as a columnist in this country where 35 years ago I would have, like, whatever. Like, we can't pick when we were born, and that's just the reality of things right now. And let's not pretend that actually it's harder still for white men. Like they can still figure it out.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about how anti-racism is racism, and I always like to think, yeah, when people think about advancement within the workplace or policies that support advancement in the workplace, because advancement doesn't necessarily come through, we're missing out the piece around retention. And so, sure, people can go into the positions, and positions can be deemed to be for racialized people. Doesn't necessarily mean that the racialized person is going to be welcome and included in a way that they're going to be holding that space. I also, coming from the north, I'm in the Yukon, but there's been a lot of interesting conversations around advancements and specifically for First Nations people. And I'm thinking of our friends at NWT, Northwest Territories, where the government mentioned around public service that for 1 year, they're going to halt hiring of white people, or they're proposing the halt of hiring for white people to make sure that First Nations people of the land have a better chance of advancing. Oh my gosh, the chaos that revolved around that language. Around that language, but even that proposal. And we're talking about the North, where people, and even myself, I fell in that trap of, we respect the First Nations. You see it everywhere. Nobody who is white ever holds a conversation or questions on, why do we do land acknowledgements? Why do we talk about the First Nations peoples of this land? And yet, when it comes to challenging their places of comfort and privilege, it's chaos. It's like, it can happen. And we're talking about for 1 year. Again, we're not even talking about the retention of the people that are going to be hired. So for me, that's really interesting. And I think those are conversations that we need to happen. Like sometimes I'm very fast on being like, whatever, I don't have time for you. And sometimes I'm like, like, no, I need to talk the specifics with you for you to understand that your whiteness, everything is centered around whiteness. Whiteness is comfortable. Whiteness is gushy. Whiteness is being able to go from one place to another. Whiteness is leave without pay. Whiteness is money. Whiteness is power. And that in itself is racist. I also wanted to address around the initiatives, and we don't talk about it, but the theft that happens and theft in identity. I cannot speak for First Nations people or Indigenous peoples and how the theft of those positions come into play. But what I can say, having it happen to me many, many times, is when you have positions that are declared for racialized people, designated for racialized people, and suddenly the white person who has always identified as white, the day that the closing period happens, is suddenly a racialized person. You as a white person need to call that out. You as a white person who is comfortable, who is already in that position, need to say, hey, something's not right here. We need to have an audit. We need to question this. And if you're in the positions of hiring, you yourself need to ask the questions. Hey, you've been working here for 5 years and suddenly I'm noticing that you're in equity or you're speaking on experiences that you've never talked about before because they weren't sexy, because there wasn't money tied to it or permanency tied to it. So we need to talk about this. And you need to be able to explain this to me, because often that's another way that makes us, racialized people exhausted, is it brings it up to the responsibility is put onto us to call it out when we, again, are not in positions of safety where we can call it out. The minute we call it out, it's, oh, you're questioning this person, you're causing trouble, you're the one who's not being good with the rest of your teamwork, you're not the person who is seeing the advancements of this workplace and working against EDI, and therefore you're not a good fit for this organization. Mm-hmm. Look at those things, be aware, open your eyes, sorry to be ableist, but be mindful of how these things come into play and how they become a detriment to racialized people as well.
Amazing. We could have a long conversation. I have many thoughts on the double layer of harm that has been caused to Indigenous people. One is completely stripping their identity such that we have people finding out they're Indigenous now, and it's like this whole category of, it's different, but we won't go into it today. We're coming to the end, so just a few more minutes. I wonder, to the extent we might be able to pick up one more question or theme from some of the questions we've had in. I think we've touched on mostly everything. I don't know if we want to dive into some more concrete action that can be taken, perhaps vis-a-vis the sort of getting the, even I think moving beyond just student feedback surveys, but like universities are running things out on their students, like how many classes do you take that have indigeneity in them, and those this sort of anonymization of the responses and whether that data is helpful. Is that sort of data a useful way of producing movement, or is it harmful?
Yeah, so I think that this is a really good question, because student feedback surveys are totally bullshit. I mean, the fact that they're used at all, ever, is just like, what is the point? Faculty members should have the right to use them if they want to get feedback from students, but they should not be used in tenure and promotion. And I know that in Alberta, they literally are tied to your salary. So if you get bad student reviews, you will have you won't get this prime that they offer or something like this. So and again, because I see this from my partner who speaks very bad French, you can imagine what his student surveys are like. They're not great compared to his Francophone colleagues. They're not as emphasized in Quebec as they are in other parts of Canada, thank God. So I think that, anytime that we're doing data collection, it's going to, white supremacy will be there. That's how it is. And so we have to think of the data tools that we're collecting. How are they being used? What are they trying to gauge? And what's the purpose? Because I suspect that if a university is 70% of students said that they had some sort of Indigenous contact within their courses in the last semester, then the university would declare that they are now decolonized, right? That's literally what they're using this for. And so in that case, the answer could be 100% and it's still meaningless. Like it doesn't matter. There's no quality of what the responses actually mean. And then when they're used as a weapon against non-white professors, it's absolutely something that needs to collapse. So then I think the real question is, how do you fight it? And of course, yeah. And so Daryl asked, how do we in our positions take this on? It would probably be useful to hear from professors anonymously about what they feel about the surveys. Like, have you ever gotten information that has improved your course, or has all the information that you've ever got been confirming something you already knew? Because any professor who's on the ball, like they're not reading the surveys and going, oh, I was disorganized this semester. They know that more than you guys do. Like, obviously they were disorganized, or, oh, the students thought it was boring. Yeah, I'm not a clown. So of course they think it's boring. I'm teaching math. What the hell do they expect? This kind of stuff. So, this does need to be a fight that faculty unions take on, for sure. But then really engaging with professors about what are there other ways that students and professors can develop tools to allow for some sort of feedback mechanism to professors that isn't going to penalize them, that isn't going to open the door for harm, that actually does extract really interesting and thoughtful reactions to courses. And partly, what's the real reason we have student feedback surveys? Well, we've got classes that are too big. And professors, like if you had 20 people in your class, you wouldn't need a feedback survey. You know exactly what your students think of you. And so again, these are tools that have grown out of the neoliberal university, and they've been grown out of the tuition fee driven university, where students are like, I'm paying a lot of money. I deserve to be able to tell my professor when he's boring. And so because student surveys are oriented towards the students, this is something you have to do in consultation with student activists as well. But it's another example, and you should look at across the department. What are those things that are causing racist things to happen to you as a professor? And you can only know that when you're really sitting down and talking with professors, or again, what kind of experiences are you experiencing in the news, in the mailroom? What kind of experiences are you experiencing in physical plant, right? Really detailing this in a way that isn't mass data collection, but actually like proper organizing with people to try and identify how to improve things at your school.
Yeah, really briefly, because I whatever that word is, of University of Ottawa. And I remember specifically on the surveys and how many racialized teachers, professors would get really bad notes and poor notes because of their French. And a lot of them were not white, they were actually racialized. And so it was really interesting. A lot of my friends and I would be like, this is really interesting. These are professors that come from French-speaking countries in Africa, and yet the students here are saying we do not understand their French. Why? Because it's not the Quebec French, or it's not the standardized French from France. So yeah, thanks for adding that conversation and rejogging that memory into my mind. For me, surveys, it's, yeah, I always think they're kind of a joke, because I'm like, what is this? From 1 to 5, what was your experience? A lot of times, as Nora mentioned, universities know what the answers are and choose deliberately not to care for it. How many times have we heard that tuition fees were too expensive? How many times have international students have said, this is ridiculous, we're paying 3 times, if not more, than the domestic students? Had they really taken in consideration student surveys, the universities that we know today would not look like what they look like. I agree with the language around being specific on the experience itself, but I also think it needs to come with the education of who's reading those surveys. So for example, if a person who's reading those surveys do not understand the experience of microaggression, racial gaslighting, white guilt, white privilege, how do those things come and manifest in an institution that upholds white supremacy and don't want to use even the word white supremacy on those surveys, then they're useless. They don't go for anything. The flip of the coin, or whatever you want to call it, I do think it's important to also recognize where that auditing happens, who gets to collect that data and how it's being used. And also, how do people feel safe, if any, to share? So for example, and we tend to forget around identities and queer identities, trans identities, people who, again, are not safe on campus. And do they feel safe disclosing their full identity without fear of retribution? So those types of things we need to be mindful of. Is how is that data being collected, and do the people who are being asked to contribute to that data, do they even feel safe in disclosing?
Thank you so much. Mindful of time, I'm going to run us a little over time to let you have last words, but if people need to leave right away, I want to make the sort of closing statements of thank you to PSAC 610, PSAC 555, and PSAC 901 for hosting this event, and thank you to the audience for attending. If you need to leave, please do so, but I would like to have final statements as well. And just a reminder, the recurring note from both our speakers today about how you need to work with other unions on your campus to see outside of your own narrow field is probably one of the biggest things you can do to really work with a union on these issues. So that was really great advice, from my opinion anyway. I'll hand it back to you for final thoughts.
Okay, I guess I'll go so that Paige can wrap it up for us. I think so. The whole everybody that tuned in hopefully was here to how do white people do anti-racism. I hope you have a lot of ideas for that, and don't get stuck on doing things perfectly. Do things humbly. Do things in good faith. Be transparent. Be open. Don't unload your problems on people. This isn't therapy, right? This is activism. They're not like, don't make people around you your best friends. You should keep friends somewhere else who are not all political. And do everything that you can wherever you're located to fight racism, because these are massive problems. They are not problems that will be solved by a single movement, by a single group of people, by a single institution. It's not as if Trent University coming up with the solution for institutional racism is going to change the Ontario university system, for example, right? Literally, that's not how this is going to work. So you have to be committed to the struggle, understand that the victories are few and far between, pace yourself, reach out across those sectors, reach out across generations, and make sure that you're operating in as much of a good way as you can. And if you don't know what that means, just fake it until you get called out quietly and like, ooh, I'm going to recorrect, course correct. Ooh, got called out again, gonna course correct, you know? Always do this stuff humbly, and always do this stuff with like very with a very clear vision of why you're doing it. And if you are present in that, if your ego is present in that, you are going to make mistakes. So ditch the ego, drop the white tears. No one cares how guilty you are. No one cares about how much money your family passed you on and how guilty you are that you were given $100,000. Literally, no one wants to hear that. Keep that quiet. Talk to your therapist about it, and do this kind of work. Do the work that people are asking you to do, and it'll be good.
I'll make mine very brief because I am a very fierce supporter of therapy. Thanks, Nora, for mentioning that. But I know folks at Kingston, Queens, you folks just went through quite the interesting bargaining times, and I believe Western, you folks are about to enter bargaining. Bring those discussions into bargaining sessions. You know, when you're talking about advocating for mental health and mental wellness and the right to disconnect, recognize what are the racialized impacts of those and how those conversations specifically affect racialized people and within their intersectionalities. And when you're at the negotiation table and your employer is saying no, push back and make sure that it's a priority. Because again, that's a way in which that your voice, when you are at the table and you are representing that power of the workers, comes into play for the folks who aren't necessarily at the table. We haven't even talked about who gets to be on the bargaining table and how are those representatives being chosen. And that's something I challenge you folks, is in terms of when you're going at the bargaining table and you're going to vote for your representatives, who are you putting at the table to represent everybody's needs? Think about that. And finally, talk to yourselves across sectors, across units. You know, you don't want to be at the same place where Kingston was or Queens was. Laurier just finished their bargaining session and it was tough for them. Talk to them and say, hey, what was it that you folks weren't able to get that we can get at our table? Put a spin on racialized support and anti-racism, so that the next time you folks get into bargaining, they get to say that the table gets to say, actually, they won it at Western, so you can do it, because the universities and the employers are actually doing the same thing as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time today. It's really greatly appreciated, and I'm appreciated, I'm sure, by the audience as well. It was very enlightening. I took notes and very enthusiastic about labor moving forward. I'm very much about labor getting back to being more radical. And I want to see that taking down the sort of capitalist neoliberal infrastructure of the university, which is the problem. The argument to redirect your anger should be something that everyone takes away as well. So thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for attending.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Karuna, I don't